Mars Hill now, and within Mars Hill, I'm going to cover some very simple or similar concepts to a little bit of what I covered in APOL. So if you find those, it's probably intentional. But basically, Mars Hill does have a lot of similarities to apologetics. Psst, there's a reason we're doing the camps in the same week. So if I say something that sounds familiar, if I say something that sounds similar to something I just said, it's probably intentional because the two events do have some similarities between them. I'm going to cover the same three things here. I'm going to cover the basics of Mars Hill, the rules and the ballots, and then look at the goals that you should have with Mars Hill Impromptu. So let's start off with the basics. First off, what is Mars Hill Impromptu? What is Mars Hill? What is it as an event? What differentiates it from other events? Specifically, what differentiates it from apologetics? Mars Hill is one of the three limited preparations events. Obviously, one of them is apologetics, one of them is Mars Hill, the other one is extent. Extent's the best, but we won't talk about that right now. We spent last week talking about that. Mars Hill, though, is one of the three limited preparation events, which means it's a similar concept to apologetics. You only have a certain amount of time in the context of the round. Actually, it's the same amount of time to prep for your speech. Mars Hill Impromptu, and this is also from the STOA website, is a speech event that trains students to connect culture with Christianity. So your goal is going to be to connect culture, connect the world around you, connect what people around you believe with Christian truths, with things that are in the Bible, with things that are communicated through the Scriptures. Students learn how to identify the universal themes contained in various classic and popular artistic genres. So you're also going to focus on learning what the themes of a certain topic, learning what the themes of a book, of a movie, of a song, of whatever the new category is going to be. You try to find what?
Mixed media.
Yeah, that one. So basically, it's just like let's throw all the things that we can't decide about in one category. Talk about that later. Okay. Basically, though, you're going to identify universal themes. You're going to identify the things that you can see in numerous different topics, the things you can see in numerous different books, movies, TV shows, whatever it might be, not TV shows anymore. But you're going to try to find those topics, you're going to try to find those themes, and speak about those. Let's talk about information. Talk about information, what the information comes from, how that information is stored in apologetics. It's slightly different here in Mars Hill. The information is going to be compiled into summaries for each topic. You're going to have a summary of a topic. You're going to have a few quotes in scriptures. You're going to have information at your disposal, but there are some overriding guidelines. We'll get to those when we get to preparation rules. But you are going to have information that you're going to use as a basis to explain a topic, explain its theme, and critique that as well. These summaries are going to include synopses, quotes, and scriptures. That's basically all it's going to cover, different forms of synopses, quotes, and scriptures. We're going to talk about how to format your Mars Hill cards, maybe later today, maybe tomorrow if we don't have time to get to it today. But your summaries are going to include a lot of this information. Finally, you condense this information onto a note card during prep time. Unlike apologetics, where you can have all of your information on a note card going into the speech, going into prep time, you have to write everything down on a blank note card in prep time for Mars Hill, which means A, your wrist starts to hurt, but B, you don't have as much information usually for Mars Hill. You don't have as many quotes, you don't have as many scriptures as you might in apologetics because you have to write everything down. You usually don't have time to write as much down as you could when you're prepping in a relatively infinite amount of time. So what that means is you're going to have a little less information at your disposal when you're giving a Mars Hill speech, which means it's going to have to fill in a little bit more with your analysis, with what you believe, with what you think, with what your opinion is. Thirdly, the inspiration. What is the inspiration for Mars Hill? This actually comes from the Bible. This inspiration, the inspiration for Mars Hill, comes from Paul's speech on Mars Hill in Acts 17. It is not an impromptu event named after our club like I thought it was my freshman year. I was like, wait, that's really confusing. Anyway, the inspiration comes from Paul's speech in Mars Hill in Acts 17. It's basically where he goes to Athens and he says, look, you have all these gods, you even have this altar to this unknown god. Just in case you didn't cover one, let me tell you about a God that could actually satisfy all of these concerns. Let me tell you about something that can solve the problem that you've been so desperately trying to solve and been spending so much marble building statues to try to solve it. In this speech, Paul built a bridge to communicate the truth of the gospel to unbelievers. He said, look, here's where you are. I'm going to take you over here across this chasm, and I'm going to build a bridge to do it. I'm going to connect these two perspectives so that I can bring these unbelievers over to the perspective that I have, to the perspective, the clarity that I have when I'm viewing the Scriptures, or even just viewing Christian worldview. He did so with grace and poise, but also effectively. One of the things I love about Paul's speech on Mars Hill, and I've used it as an inspiration to try to grow in my speaking as well, is that he spoke with grace and poise. He didn't call them stupid for having so many altars to so many gods, and even having an unknown God, but he just said, look, this is what's happening. I'm going to be graceful about this, but he was still effective in communicating his message. It was a perfect balance between still communicating something that disagreed with somebody and communicating that with grace and poise. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to delivery on Wednesday. I'm going to actually go through his Acts 17 speech, kind of pick it apart to determine, look, here's what he did, here's what we can do in our speeches as well. Now let's move on to rules and the ballot. What are some things on the rules that are important? What are some things on the ballot that are important as well? First, let's talk about preparation rules. Everyone loves to talk about prep rules, right? Competitors may bring a binder of information but cannot bring pre-written outlines. In apologetics, you can outline your speech, you can have everything crafted, so all you have to do is stand up with your note card and be done. In Mars Hill, you can't do that. You have a binder of information. Usually, I think it has to be a binder. I think the rules actually say it has to be a binder. I don't know why. But it has to be a binder, but you cannot bring pre-written outlines in. You cannot outline your speech. You can't have, look, point 1 is going to be this, point 2 is going to be this, point 3 is going to be this. Now, what that does not mean is that you cannot have a list of things. You cannot have, look, here are 3 things that I think are important about this. Thing 1, thing 2, thing 3. As long as that's not going to be the outline for your speech or what pattern or what structure your speech is going to follow. So you have information, but you cannot pre-outline this information. Competitors can only write notes on a single blank note card during prep. You can only have one note card. You're stuck with that one. It has to be blank going in. You have to write down all of the information you're going to stand up and give your speech with onto that single note card in 4 minutes. What that means is sometimes your card is not going to have much on it and it's going to be a little stressful for you. There were times when I just understood what I was going to talk about, like in my second point, and I'd stand up and my second point would have no information on it. And it kind of do a double take a little bit. You're like, ooh, okay. But yeah, you have to write down everything, which means you're going to have to be very careful about what you choose to write down, about the things you choose to write down to make sure that you have. Only have the most important things so you can make sure you have them all. Finally, competitors have 4 minutes to prepare a 6-minute speech, exact same as APOL. You have 4 minutes of prep, and then you have 6 minutes to speak on what you prep during that 4 minutes.
So the binder, I guess you'll tell us what can be in the binder when you later, right?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
I'm actually going to cover that either at the end of the day today or tomorrow.
Okay.
How to format your individual cards, how to organize your binder, and what kind of information you can have in there. Basically, you can have any form of information that you want to. It just can't be in the structure of an outline. It can't be formatted into an outline. You also don't want to have too much information so you can't sift through it. Remember a couple years ago, one of the kids in our club wrote a 6-page card on Dark Knight Rises because, like, it's Dark Knight Rises. Like, come on. But I got into a round, tried to use it, and I just couldn't because there was too much there, too much information. So just understand that you have to write down and process that information in a very short amount of time, but you can have any information you want to.
You couldn't give a speech on Dark Knight Rises.
Oh, I could give a speech on Dark Knight Rises. The card was just a little overwhelming.
That's because you were sharing
Yeah.
summaries.
Yeah. I forget who wrote it though. Okay, presentation rules. Competitors should show the correlation of the theme with biblical truth. Now again, all of these things are things that are in the rules themselves, so these are things that you must do in order to have a legitimate Mars Hill speech. Competitors should show the correlation of the theme with biblical truth. In other words, you want to show the relationship between two things. You want to compare and contrast. You want to look at the impacts or the effects of both. What you are not doing in Mars Hill is looking at either of these in a vacuum. You're not just critiquing or tearing down the theme or topic of a movie or book or song. You're also not just standing up and talking about the Bible. You have to talk about a correlation or a relationship between the two things. You have to show how they fit together and what makes them similar, what makes them different. A competitor should assume that the audience is not familiar with the Bible. We talked in apologetics about how you have to assume that your audience is curious, uninformed, or not in agreement with you. Mars Hill is a little more specific. Mars Hill assumes that your audience is not familiar with the Bible in any context. So when you're standing up and when you're talking, you're usually not going to want to say, well, in Romans, Paul says this, because they're going to be like, who's this Paul guy? He doesn't even have a last name. Why should I trust him? So you should assume that they don't know much about the Bible. Now, sure, there are some stories that people are probably going to have heard of. Most people are probably going to know the story about Noah and the flood, so you can kind of reference that. But understand that people aren't going to look at it as, people are going to try not to look at it as a part of the Bible. They're going to try to look at it in a similar context like you might stories from Greek mythology or Norse mythology. At least that's what judges might try to do in their minds as they're judging. Again, you're going to have Christian judges most likely in Mars Hill, so it's going to be a little difficult. But they're going to try to assume that they don't know much about the Bible. You're going to have to instruct them and teach them about that instead of just showing them and assuming they already agree with you. Finally, the speech should leave the listener wanting to hear more on the subject. Now, you never want to leave a speech leaving your listener wanting to know less about the subject. That generally means that either A, you are super abrasive, or B, you're really boring. You want to make sure the listener wants to hear more, wants to learn more about the subject, but you can do so in a few specific ways. You can do so by asking questions at the end of their speech to kind of provoke thoughts in the minds of the judges. You can do so by challenging them to do certain things, or making sure that they continually think and might even go home and try to learn more about whatever you're discussing. One of the things in the rule that is most important is that you want to communicate something to a judge that they want to hear more about, not that they want to hear less about. Let's talk about the analysis section of the ballot. The analysis section is also the place where there is uniqueness as opposed to other ballots. For the most part, the delivery section is going to be pretty much the same. The content section is going to be pretty much the same. But the analysis and the rhetoric sections are really where there is a delineation between different events. The first thing you should always think about explaining is explaining why something matters. I talked about this in apologetics just a few minutes ago. You want to do the same thing here. You want to make sure that you are impacting what matters to a judge. You want to make sure you are saying to a judge, look, here's the thing. This is true, this is the worldview, this is the theme of this specific topic, but here's also why that matters. Here's also the impacts that it has. Now here's a Christian worldview, here's the impacts of that. Here's the impacts of believing what the Bible says. You want to make sure that you explain why something matters not only to yourself, but also to the judge. You should be doing this in all of your speech events. You should always be impacting things to why they matter, but there is an especial focus on this in Mars Hill because it's on the ballot. And if you don't do it, it's going to be staring a judge in the face saying, did they do this? And their answer is going to be no, and you're going to lose. Use cultural references to highlight the truth you're communicating. This is also a part of the ballot. Judges expect you not only to deal with the theme of the topic, but also to explain some cultural references as to how that manifests itself, how we can see that in the world, what happens in the world around us. For instance, if you're giving a speech on a struggle for identity, that people don't know who they are, you can look around and show how people are always trying to find their identity in brands, they're trying to find their identities in movements, like the next biggest thing. They're always trying to associate themselves, put themselves into groups where they feel like they can find their identities. It's not a great example, I know. But you want to make sure that you use cultural references to highlight that truth you're communicating, to show, look, here's what happens here, but here are the cultural impacts of the society in which we find our identity in Christ, in which we find our identity in His Word, in what we're trying to accomplish through our faith. Use cultural references to highlight both of those concepts, both your theme and the topic, as well as your faith and the Christian worldview you're trying to communicate. Finally, compare the worldview or themes of the Bible with the topic. People expect you to analyze this by comparing the theme directly with the theme that might be relevant to that in the Scriptures. Notice here how this analysis section does not say that you have to show how the Bible disagrees with the theme of the topic. That's not always necessarily the case. That's not always necessarily something that we see. For instance, when I give my speech on Phantom of the Opera this last year, I didn't give a speech about how the two things disagreed with each other. I gave a speech about how the theme of the Phantom of the Opera, a struggle for identity found only through love, is similar, how it's almost the same as it is through the scriptures. So just because you have to compare the worldview or themes of the Bible with your topic does not mean that they are going to be different. Yes?
Did Mrs. Reeves let you know that the word worldview is now off the new Marcel ballot?
She didn't.
It's no longer on there. It's kind of a huge thing.
Yes! Okay, cool. That's great, because I always hated the concept of
And the
worldviews.
reason why they're tired of the kids getting in there and saying, there's a guy named Jesus, and this is it, and
Okay.
they're just, it's not being used the way it's supposed to be, so they're taking the word out.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, all this information is from the 2015-2016 ballots and rules,
And they haven't
because
come out yet. But
they haven't published the new ones yet.
But it's not done yet.
But that's really important too. So every time there's a worldview/theme, get rid of the worldview and do a little happy dance in your mind. You don't have to worry about those anymore, so I'm not going to tell you how much better your life is going to be or how miserable your life would have been had worldviews persisted. Let's move on to rhetoric now. Rhetoric, yeah, stuff and things and speaking. Okay, have a conversational delivery, don't be formulaic. We talked about this a little bit in apologetics. The struggle is very real here too. It's very hard to determine what it means to be conversational when you're standing up and giving a speech. Again, kind of make a little note. I'm going to cover this on Wednesday. I'm going to go over a delivery lecture. I'm going to have a whole section of slides dealing with how to be conversational, at least in how I've worked through it. A lot of that I also talked through, about a couple weeks ago, I talked through with Josiah Tay and Taryn Murphy. We were just kind of chilling on Facebook for some reason. And we started a conversation about what it means to be conversational in these speeches, so I'll share with you some of those insights as well. But it's really important to make sure that you have a conversational delivery when you're giving your Mars Hill speech. Again, conversational doesn't mean informal, it just means, well, I'll talk about that later. Okay. Speak to the common man, one who is unfamiliar or in disagreement with the truth of the scriptures. Assume that you're walking up to some guy in the street and you're like, hey, you see that new movie the other week? And he's going to be like, yeah. You're going to be like, what'd you think about that? You're going to speak to a judge like you would speak to him. You're going to speak to a judge like you're just speaking to a man that you just randomly pulled off the street and sat down. That's kind of what judges are sometimes, so speak to them like that anyway. But you're speaking to one who is unfamiliar with or in disagreement with the scriptures. So assume even if they know what the scriptures are, they think the scriptures are a whole bunch of hocus pocus that was just invented as some ploy to make money or something like that. I don't know. I met this guy once who thought that the entire Bible was to fuel consumerism in the early Middle East. I'm like, what? Anyway, assume that you're going to meet people like that and just be very careful with how you present the scriptures. Be very intentional with how you present the scriptures. Don't necessarily say, well, the scriptures say this because this is true. Say, the scriptures say this, and I can see how this is true in my own life. I can see how this impacts me, and it's up to you about whether you want to take that or not. You can take it or leave it, but this is how it impacts me. This is what the scriptures mean to me. This is what the scriptures mean to those of my friends, the people around me that believe in the same thing. Use it as a tool, not necessarily as an ultimate authority. Is it an ultimate authority? Absolutely it is. But a person who is uninformed about the scriptures or in disagreement will not think that the scriptures are an authority. It will actually take away from your credibility as opposed to adding to it. I'll talk about the balance between that a little bit later as well. Finally, provoke an ongoing conversation. This is both in the ballot and in the rules, and this is something that they just added this last year. You want to provoke an ongoing conversation. You want to be one of those friends who asks one of those questions that just get people going, you know? You want to make sure that people continually consider something, that people are constantly asking themselves more questions. Hey, but how would this apply to this circumstance? How would this apply to my life, even if I just tried that? Ask yourself those questions and ask the judge those questions. Make sure that you're provoking an ongoing conversation.